This morning's scripture reading is taken from Genesis 1, verses 26 through 31. Then God said, "Let us make human beings in our image, to be like us. They will reign over the fish in the sea, the birds in the sky, the livestock, all the wild animals on the earth, and the small animals that scurry along the ground." So God created human beings in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. Then God blessed them and said, "Be fruitful and multiply. Fill the earth and govern it. Reign over the fish in the sea, the birds in the sky, and all the animals that scurry along the ground." Then God said, "Look, I've given you every seed-bearing plant throughout the earth and all the fruit trees for your food. And I've given you every green plant as food for all the wild animals, the birds in the sky, and the small animals that scurry along the ground, everything that has life." And that is what happened. Then God looked over all he had made, and he saw that it was very good. And evening passed, and morning came, marking the sixth day.
Good morning. Good morning. Any similarity in the voices of the person that just read to you and mine is mere coincidence. We're not related at all. Actually, that was my dad. We used to go to church when I was a kid, and he would read, and I would be the altar boy. And now he's still reading, and I'm the priest. Things have evolved. Before I get started, for you weren't here, but first service we had, we took angel tree gifts in today, and someone brought an angel tree gift at some point this week. It's a big rectangle box, and they put no identifying information on it whatsoever. So we have no idea who it's from or who it goes to. So Dana got up front and was making an announcement about that, and I brought it up, and I sort of modeled it for everyone in kind of Vanna White style, hoping that we could shame someone into acknowledging, like, "Oh, that's mine. I'm sorry. I forgot to put my name on it." Nobody claimed it, but Dana made a joke about how, we used to sit, every once in a while you sit around, you have conversations about, fundraising opportunities for the churches and stuff like that. Years ago, churches used to do fashion shows. They used to get people in the church to, model stuff and, invite people to come and buy it, And so this idea has come up, and kind of like potlucks, I have put a total kibosh on these ideas. It's like, no, we are not ever, under any circumstances, are we ever doing a fashion show. I did a fashion show this morning. Dana pointed that out to everybody. But it just reminded me like how weird we are. Like what the church is just a weird place. And if you've been in the church long enough, you forget how weird it is and how weird we are, that someone was sitting in a room at some point and thought, I know. Let's model things and invite people to come and buy the things that we're modeling, because that's what everybody wants to do. We're just weird people. Sometimes I've been in the church for so long that I forget just how odd we are. But it's okay. You can embrace our oddity. We are odd folks. This is week 4 in a series that I'm calling Listen to the Longing. If you haven't been here, the kind of idea behind this series, sort of the idea behind this whole year is, from the church's perspective, to understand what it means to be human. Right? If you think about humanity as a mystery that we're all trying to figure out, we're all trying to figure out what it means to be human in this world. From the church's perspective, if you really want to understand what it means to be human, you have to reflect deeply on the life of Jesus. So the church would say that it really is only in the mystery of the Word made flesh, right? The story about Jesus, that the mystery of being human gains clarity. Right? So from the church's perspective, it might say that the world you live in, at best, is incapable of telling you the whole truth about what it means to be human. At worst, it's actively lying to you. So the church's perspective would be, look, if you want to understand what it means to be human, look at the life of Jesus and reflect on the life of Jesus. And so every year, that's what the church does. The church takes the story about Jesus, the story of the mystery of the Word made flesh, and breaks it into 4 seasons, or 4 parts, like 4 parts of a book. Advent, Epiphany, Lent, and Easter, and then it tells that story year after year after year after year after year. And the point of doing that is so that people who subject themselves to that narrative will ground their sense of self, their identity, their understanding of what it means to be human in that story. That's what we're doing. We're telling this Jesus story as a way of reflecting on what does it tell us about the mystery of being human beings, what it means to be human in the world. So this part one, this is Advent. These are the weeks that lead up to the birth of Jesus at Christmas. So in this series, what we're doing is we're just asking the question, what does Jesus' birth tell us about what it means to be human? So I've entitled this series, Listen to the Longing. This is week 4, so it's chapter 4. I've entitled this The Over and Under Man. The Over and Under Man. I'll explain that in just a minute. If you haven't been here, the ground we've covered so far, the average human being gets up and finds him or herself caught, trapped between our finiteness on the one hand and what I've called a taste for the infinite on the other. So on the one hand, we're all limited. We know that. We feel that and experience that every day. And yet, it's as if our constitution requires us to always be pushing beyond those limits. We're always stretching out beyond ourselves. Like we're trying to become something that we are not yet, or we're trying to reach a destination that we haven't arrived at yet, but we long for it. Right? Something's unfinished, something's not complete, and it drives us forward in different ways. And we've talked about if you listen to that longing long enough, carefully enough, I think you have to conclude that the longing is religious. And what I mean by that is I don't think you can explain it without recourse to God. I think what you long for, what I long for, is what we've called transcendence. What you want is hope, joy, peace, love. But if you carry any of those transcendentals out to their kind of logical endpoints, you're really just talking about names for God. The perfection of love, the perfection of joy, the perfection of hope, peace, that's just what the church calls God. And I think if you dial it back, what you're realizing is that what we long for is God or something to do with God. But we experience kind of a frustration here, and it's what I've called an ugly ditch. There's a gap between us and the God that we long for. Just like you can't get into the mind of another person, you can't fully know, you can't totally know another person because you can't get inside of their mind, you also can't fully know or totally grasp God. You can't directly get into the mind of God. So it sort of frustrates us as human beings. We can't actually know the God that we long for. And so stuck in this place, human beings, we're just always grasping. Right? We long for transcendence, we long for God, we long for something more. We can't directly access it or grab it or achieve it. So the best we can do is, by our own effort, try. And a lot of our human life is a kind of grasping after the satisfaction of this longing that we have. But what I want to do this morning to kind of add sort of the last chapter to this story, this part of the story before Christmas, I want to talk about 2 of the lies that I think the world we live in tries to tell us, right? Nature abhors a vacuum. So if you remove God from the equation, either because you can't directly access God or because you've actually intentionally taken God out of the story, you need a story. You need some story that tells you what it means to be human. So I want to talk about 2 of the stories that the world provides for us, both of which I think are lies and ultimately unsatisfying. One's a Promethean lie, and one's a kind of pathetic lie. And we'll talk about both of them. I'm going to start by just acknowledging we struggle to think rightly about ourselves, don't we? I mean, that is to think soberly about ourselves. Most human beings, myself certainly included, we tend to either think too highly of ourselves, right? More highly of ourselves than we ought, or we think too lowly of ourselves. There's probably always been a human tendency, but since the rise of rationalism and the Enlightenment, it feels like it's taken deeper roots. Like if you have ever read any of the great thinkers of the modern period, when they reflect on the nature of what it means to be human, their answers almost always move to one of these opposite extremes. That humans are either godlike on the one hand, or you're no different than the animals of the field. You're either exceptional, or you're ironically using your exceptionalism to convince yourself you're not exceptional at all. You're either godlike, or you're nothing. These are the two tendencies that we tend to move toward when you're trying to understand what it means to be human purely rationally, right? You're trying to have a rational way of explaining what it means to be human. These are mutually exclusive. They're opposed ways of thinking about humanity. The irony, though, is that they're kind of locked together. They go hand in hand. You can't have one without the other. I don't know, for those of you who are old enough, an author describes it this way, I like this illustration. For those of you who are old enough to remember Michael Jackson and his song Beat It, he did a music video for that song. And in that music video, there's a scene where these two gang members, these rival gang members, are going to have a knife fight, but they tie their ankles together, so they're like doing this number, right? They're opposed to one another, but they're locked together. They can't get away from each other. And it's this sort of conundrum that the modern person finds himself in. We have these two different ways of thinking about what it means to be human. Either we're godlike or we're no different than animals. And we think these are two mutually exclusive ways of thinking about being human, but they're locked together. One kind of leads to and reinforces the other. Right? Maybe the clearest way to see the connection, think about the way that we think about the individual today. So in Western contemporary culture, the individual, the personal self, the internal, psychological, authentic self has been elevated to godlikeness. It is sacrosanct. Unlike any other time in the history of humanity, especially Western culture, we have gotten to a place where it is assumed that you have, as an individual person, you have the godlike capacity and power to entirely self-determine. You get to decide who you are, what you are, where you're going. You get to decide for yourself what is right and wrong and good and bad. So we've taken the individual person, especially the internal psychological person, and we've kind of elevated that to almost godlike status. It's sacrosanct, right? You cannot challenge what another human being says about themselves anymore. Ironically, the further you go down that road, right, all of life closes in on the self. You get to a certain point where quite literally nothing else matters except what your internal psychological self thinks that you need and want. The whole world closes in on you like a black hole. Every day becomes nothing more than what I think, what I want, what I feel, my impulses, my desires, my opinions. And in that way, ironically, you're not a whole lot different than an animal in the field. Every day they get up, and what is life about? It's about eating and drinking and reproducing. It's an impulsive life. There's nothing significant about it in the sense that it has any broader meaning or mission or substance or purpose. They just get up every day and they do their thing. The same thing is happening in Western culture. That we have told people, you're your own God, determine things for yourself. And in the process of going down that road, the self is all that matters anymore. So you see this very strange, and I think historically unique situation now, where you have people who simultaneously have embraced an almost godlike freedom and power, and they're also exceptionally depressed and lonely. That you take a kind of godlike liberty that you think sort of raises you to this level of godlike status, only to find out that all of your godlike status has left you no different than all of the non-godlike creatures in the world. This is the strange conundrum of modernity. It's a totally irrational rationalism. It's when you try to explain what it means to be human with a kind of pure objective rationalism, you end up painting yourself into an irrational corner. All of your ideas become kind of self-defeating. I want to read you a passage. I don't know how familiar you are with the author G.K. Chesterton. He wrote a book called Orthodoxy. This is how he describes it in his classic British style. This is what he says. This is the conundrum. This is the sort of self-defeating inconsistency of trying to understand what it means to be human without reference to God. He says, a Russian pessimist will denounce a policeman for killing a peasant and then prove by the highest philosophical principles that the peasant ought to have killed himself. A man denounces marriage as a lie and then denounces aristocratic profligates for treating it as a lie. He calls a flag a bauble and then blames the oppressors of Poland or Ireland because they take away the bauble. The man of this school goes first to a political meeting where he complains that savages are treated as though they were beasts. Then he takes his hat and his umbrella and he goes on to a scientific meeting where he proves that they practically are beasts. It's his way of saying, on the one hand, we argue in our modern rational way that to be human is to be godlike, and then we turn right around, and by the same rationale, we argue that we're no better than animals. Both are kind of locked together in this irrational connection. They're opposed to each other, but they can't get away from each other. Right? One author says it's like two ferrets in a sack, just destined to duke it out. Neither one of these stories, right? Thinking too highly of ourselves or thinking too lowly of ourselves. Thinking that we're godlike on the one hand or we're really not important at all on the other. Neither one of those stories are satisfying to us as human beings. But let's just pick them apart. The first is a sort of Promethean lie. And I'm using that word intentionally. Prometheus was the Greek god of fire. In Greek mythology, Prometheus stole fire from Mount Olympus and gave it to human beings in the form of knowledge and technology and civilization. Right? All the cultural artifacts that are kind of the work of our hands, right? These are the things that we do. And what these cultural artifacts do, our knowledge, our technology, our civilizations, what they do is they trick us or tempt us into believing that we can do anything. We can overcome any problem. We can answer all the questions. Right? We can solve all the problems of the world. We can do whatever we want by the ingenuity of our own hands. Look how impressive we are. Look at the amazing things that we can do. But the Promethean lie is that we are effectively our own self-contained gods. If there happens to be a God out there, we don't need that God. We can do it ourselves. But if we just rely on our own ingenuity, our own knowledge, our own power, what problem can't we solve? Right? What horizon can we not reach? I mean, the opening chapters of the Bible are depicting this kind of Promethean tendency. I mean, whatever you think about the Bible, these stories are meant to capture universal wisdom. I mean, it's a perspective on what it means to be human. If you read the opening chapters of the Bible, the authors of the book of Genesis, they're telling you a story. And the story they're telling you is that one of our tendencies is to kind of move in this direction of self-contained God-likeness. Right? Adam and Eve is the first story of human beings. They reach for the knowledge of good and evil. You might be tempted to think that the word knowledge there means the ability to distinguish between good and evil. That's not what that word means. All of us are supposed to be able to distinguish between good and evil. What that phrase means in its natural idiom is that they reached for and grasped after the power to determine good and evil. What they were reaching for was autonomy or self-law, self-rule. Instead of receiving definitions of good and evil from outside of themselves, they were going to become the definers of it. That's the first story about human beings, is that we grasp for this power to self-determine. And you watch as the authors of Genesis relay what happens when we do that. Again, don't think of these stories so much as like there were actually two people someplace, someday, but that authors are trying to depict for you in narrative form just the story of being human. This is what we do. We grasp for self-determination. We decide for ourselves what is and is not okay, or what is good and what is evil, apart from any reference to God or any authority outside of ourselves. And what happens? Well, the first thing that happens is a kind of social deterioration. The very next scene is the first murder. Cain kills his brother Abel. So within one chapter, we've gone from people are commanded to be life givers, right? Go, procreate, fill the world, be a life giver. And within a chapter, we're life takers. But the whole intention has been reversed. And that just continues to sort of spiral out of control. A couple chapters later, you meet a man named Lamech, and he's not just killing one person. He's saying, I'm gonna exact 70 times sevenfold revenge on any one of my enemies. If you hurt me, I'm gonna retaliate without limit. And the author of the scriptures, what they're trying to demonstrate is that then becomes kind of the law of the land. It literally becomes the foundation of human civilization. In the first 11 chapters of the Bible, you see human beings develop culture. There's a mention of developing agriculture. They invent music, poetry, metal tools. They build the first human city using technology like bricks and tar for mortar. All of those scenes are the biblical author's way of saying, we grasp for the power to self-determine, and it leads to social deterioration, and that kind of social deterioration becomes the very bedrock on which we try to build human civilization. It leads to total political deterioration. Now, literally killing each other at limitless escalation now just becomes our way in the world. Those are the opening chapters of the scriptures. But this is what Friedrich Nietzsche calls the overman. That's why I've labeled this chapter the over and the underman. In Nietzsche's schema, human beings, by a pure will to power, human beings are gods. You just don't know it. You need to accept that you are a god, and you need to reach for all of your godlike power and status. And when you do, and you take matters into your own hands, human beings will finally achieve whatever are supposed to be our kind of evolutionary ends. What the opening chapters of the book of Genesis are trying to show us is that when we reach for that kind of godlike status, if we are gods, we are not good ones. And all of our technological ingenuity and all of the amazing things that we can do, and we can do amazing things, we do some really good stuff with that. You see that all the time. But we are still using all of our exceptionalism, all of our technology, all of our knowledge, all of our ingenuity and power. We're still using that in a way where we're not our brother's keepers. I'll talk in a couple months about God's intent that you take ruthless responsibility for one another. We do not do that in this world. You and I do not take ruthless responsibility for one another the way God takes responsibility for us. We're supposed to, but we don't. We don't use our exceptionalism to do that. Oftentimes, we're using our power and our will to power to dominate, to harm one another, to harm creation, to harm all that God has created. All in a kind of striving to overcome our finiteness. I mean, there are people, as we speak, there's somebody somewhere sitting in a room and talking about how to use man-made technologies like AI and robotics to transfer the human mind into a machine so that human beings can live forever. I mean, this isn't the stuff of like mythology. This is what we do. There's a part of us that we recognize that we're finite. We refuse to accept that. And one of the stories that the world tells us is you don't have to. You can overcome your finiteness by the power of your own hands. Eventually, we will figure it all out and solve all of our problems. That's the story of the overman. But the creation account that you heard this morning is meant to be a corrective to that lie, to that false narrative. It's meant to correct against this tendency toward Promethean godlikeness. Genesis assumes that there is a creator-creature divide. And the only subject on the creator side of that divide is God. God creates all that is. The best we can do as human beings is to make stuff with the stuff that God made. We can't make the stuff that God makes. God alone is the creator. Everything that has been made is made by God. So everything, including us, is in the same creaturely boat. We are obviously different from everything else that has been made, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. But the tendency is to think that because we are different than everything else that has been created, that we are somehow exceptional in a way that is separable from God. Human beings are in the same, the way the story paints it is that human beings are in the same creaturely boat as everything else. You're not any different in that regard. You are created on a day, just like everything else was created on a day. You are made from the stuff of the earth, just like everything else is made. You eat, sleep, and reproduce, just like all of the other created beings are said to reproduce. All of that imagery is meant to remind us, to reinforce, or to convince us we are creatures. We have been made. We did not make ourselves. Human beings are not self-referential. We are not self-determinative. Right? There's a phrase that gets used in this creation narrative, right? Made in the image of God. The first part of that phrase, in the image of, reminds us we are not self-referential. We are not self-determining. You didn't make yourself. You didn't name yourself. You don't get to just decide who you are and what it means to be human. Humanity is something you receive from the God who makes you. You're made in the image of. Right? You are meant to be reflective, just not self-reflective. You're meant to reflect the nature of the God who made you. That fundamental truth keeps you tethered. So when we start to believe that we are kind of our own self-contained Promethean gods, there is that story there to say, no, you're a created being, just like all of the other created beings. And that means that there are powers you don't have and things that you cannot do. We cannot unhitch or untether ourselves from the one true God of heaven and earth who makes us. That's one of the correctives of this creation account. But if it corrects against the lie or the tendency toward Promethean godlike, right, the tendency toward the overman, it also corrects against the other tendency, the other lie, which is the underman. Right? If the overman believes that he can do whatever he wants, he can self-determine, he can set his own course, he's the captain of his own ship, and by the power of his own hands, he can solve the problems of the world. If that's the lie or the tendency of the overman, the lie or the tendency of Nietzsche's underman, this is the other side, is to imagine that we're not special at all. That there's nothing exceptional about being human. That you and I are no different from the beasts of the field. We're just maybe slightly more sophisticated beasts in a slightly more complicated field. The underman gives himself to nothing except comfort and amusement, spectacles, toys. He has no mission. He has no vision. He has no passion. He has nothing outside of himself that is worth suffering for or sacrificing for or dying for. He lives kind of by the wisdom of the author of Ecclesiastes, right? Eat, drink, and be merry because tomorrow you die. This is the only life you get, and so you might as well squeeze into it as much fun as you can because when it's over, it's over. If the first lie is a kind of Promethean godlikeness, this lie is toward a kind of pathetic consumerism. It's we get up every day and our lives literally have no ultimate meaning or purpose other than go do a job, make some money, buy some stuff, have some fun. You know, the irony of the underman, and I hear this narrative all the time. The irony of the underman is that the underman often complains that the world is asking too much of him. I can't tell you how often I hear the narrative. It's so overwhelming. Everything is so stressful. I can't handle it. It's too much. I hear this narrative all the time from people. We are the most materially prosperous, most educated, safest human beings who have ever lived on the planet. Most of the diseases that would have killed you by the time you were 3, we've done away with them. In our particular civilization, you never wake up afraid that the neighboring village is going to raid your town. We send all of our children to get free public education. I mean, we live in an unparalleled, unheard of moment in human history. And I can't tell you how often I hear the narrative, life is so stressful, I can't handle it. It's all just so much. Like the world is asking too much of me. I think the truth is the world is not asking nearly enough of us. We're like what C.S. Lewis calls men without chests. We don't feel the right things for the right things. We're not committed to the right things. So when the world asks us to take responsibility, it infringes on our amusement and our spectacles. It's not that it's too much, but it feels like a weight we can't carry because we've given our lives to nothing. So many people are living in this story. And they feel it. They feel it on a deep existential level with every act of escape, right? Every swipe of the social media, right? Every act of escape, you feel it. My life doesn't mean anything. I'm not doing anything. There's nothing significant I'm giving myself to because there's nothing exceptional about being human. If the opening chapters of Genesis are meant to correct against the lie toward your kind of Promethean God likeness, they are also meant to correct against the lie that you are nothing exceptional at all. That all it means to be human is to eat, drink, and be merry, to amuse yourself to death. We may be on the same creaturely side of the divide as everything else, but the story clearly depicts that we are different. We are special. We are designated for something that everything else is not designated for. Right? All of the other animals and creatures are said to be created according to their kind. Right? We're going to create the birds of the air according to their kind and the plants of the ground according to their kind. It isn't until you get to human beings that there's no kind according to which they're created. They are literally one of a kind. They're the first of their kind. With everything else that gets created, the story says things like, let the seas produce, let the land produce. It isn't until you get to human beings where you first encounter the language, let us create. That language doesn't get used for anything else that gets created. In the narrative, God talks about everything else that gets created. God only talks with humans. There's a unique relationship there that's being depicted. And of course, human beings are the only ones who get this command, who get this commission. Go and rule over. That language means take care of. I am entrusting the world to you. It's mine. Take care of it. Take care of it like it were your own. We're the only ones that get that commission. See, if the creation story is meant to remind us we are not our own gods. We are created beings. You are tethered to God, and you can't untether yourself no matter how hard you try. It is also to remind us, this is the other part of that made in the image of God. Yes, we're made in the image, so we're not self-determining, but it's in the image of God that we're made. It's God's nature we're supposed to reflect. That is something exceptional and special that is only designated to human beings. The purpose of your life is, and the meaning of your life is not to be a cog in an economic machine where your value is in what you produce, or your value is in what you're able to sort of kick back into the system by what you purchase. To be human is not to amuse ourselves to death with comfort and toys and spectacles. We're made in the image of God, the God who made everything. And that means to be human is to participate in something unique and special, to give our lives to something more than just the stuff that we can make with our hands. Here's kind of my point. I entitled this series, Listen to the Longing. I think we all feel this longing. We all sense that we're not yet where we're supposed to be. I think that longing is religious. I think what you long for all the way down is God or some connection to God. But I think when you reach God, you are also simultaneously reaching yourselves. You are becoming who you most truly are. That is part of what we long for. It is to become what we actually are. Not Promethean self-contained gods that decide for ourselves what is and is not true, good or bad, evil, whatever, but also not pathetic consumers that give ourselves to nothing but our own enjoyment and amusement. We all recognize neither one of those stories are true. Neither one of those stories satisfy our souls. It's not who we are. But it is the story that we're told in so many ways when we go out into the world. I think the hope that we highlight as the church at Advent, the hope that we highlight is that there is a way, that God has made a way for us to actually become who we are. Not Promethean gods or pathetic consumers, but something different, something special, something designated, but something we can't do on our own. What we're going to celebrate a week from now, this hope that is deferred for so many people, that God bridges the ugly ditch, God comes to be with us in the person of Jesus of Nazareth, and the miracle that's happening at Christmas, as mysterious as it is that God becomes what we are so that we can become what God is, or what God has designed us to be. That really begins at Christmas, with God bridging the gap and coming to be with us. You long to be who you are, what you are. The frustration of being human is you can't realize that on your own. God has to come and do something on our behalf. That's what happens at Christmas. God comes to be with us, and in being with us is somehow making it possible for us to start living into what it means to be human. Not our own gods, not pathetic consumers, but people who give their lives away, who enter into the world and self-empty and self-give out of love for other people and for the world that God so loves. That's what it means to be human. And that's what God makes possible in the person of Jesus Christ, which we're going to celebrate next week. We're going to finish our service this morning by taking communion together. If you're new here, this is your first time with us at Waterville Community Church, I want you to know that you're invited to join us. The communion table is open to you. This is the church's sacrament. It's a sacrament of remembrance. So every week when we come forward and when we take the bread that represents Jesus' broken body and the juice that represents his shed blood, we are remembering. Right? The truth is, a lot of the things that I've said over the last few weeks aren't true for you. They're really not true for anybody in the sense that God already bridged the gap. You can directly access God because God made God self-knowable in the person of Jesus. And in his broken body and his shed blood on the cross, we have direct access to who our God is, a God of perfect self-giving love. And we remember that every week. We proclaim that as a church every week when we gather. But when you take these elements into your system, you're also participating. In the language of this morning's service, you're stepping in a little bit more to the truthfulness of what it means to be human. You're entering into the life of God who gives himself for the sake of the world. And the church is supposed to go out and give itself for the sake of the world. If that's what you want for your life, if that's the story that you want to participate in, then the invitation is to come forward. Be a part of the church. Respond to what you've heard by entering into it, stepping into it, and trying to live into it by faith. In just a second, I'm going to invite you to stand. I'll dismiss you starting in the back rows. So if you've not done this before, come down our center aisle. Our communion tables are on the sides of our stage here. You'll take a prepackaged communion cup back to your seat using our side aisles, and then just take that during this last song as you feel led. But all are welcome if you want to follow Jesus. Come and be part of the church. The table's set. I'm going to invite you to stand. Let me pray for us, and come forward. God, we acknowledge that we are created by you. We are part of the creaturely world. Forgive us for thinking that we can be our own gods and do our own thing. But we also acknowledge that you've made us in your image, which means we're special. You call us to something important, something significant. Forgive us for settling for so much less than what you made us for. We thank you that in the life, death, and resurrection of your Son, Jesus Christ, you've made it possible for us to more fully live into the story of what it truly means to be human. I pray that we embrace that by faith. Surrender to you and allow you to work in us, drawing us up into your very nature, leading us out into the world to live as you live. We love you. We thank you. We surrender our lives to you as we come to your table. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Weary traveler, searching for the way to go. Stranger, heavy-hearted, longing for someone to know. May you find a light. May you find to guide you home. Travelers searching everywhere you go. Strangers who are searching, longing deeply to be known. May you find a light. May you find may you find a light to guide you. May you find a light. May you find a light to guide you home.
The song reminds me of something St. Augustine said about the 4th century. He said that God has made Jesus the Christ, who is our home, to be both our home and the way by which we reach our home. He described our vision as being weak and dim. We don't have the sight to see God as God is. So God provides the light in the person of Jesus, that we might both reach our home and find ourselves in it. That God is the truth, obviously about God's self, but also about what it means to be human. That when we come home to God, we also come home to ourselves and what it means to be us.